Felix Sanders sat alone in the quiet of his sleek, glass-walled office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished desk. A thick folder lay open before him, yet another round of employee complaints. The phrases leapt off the page like silent accusations: overworked, understaffed, no breaks. 10 years ago, he had poured his soul into this company, transforming a struggling shop into a thriving retail empire with 12 locations across the state. He'd sacrificed weekends, missed birthdays, slept under his desk, because he believed in building something that mattered. But now, something had gone horribly wrong. The polished exterior was cracking. These reports, so full of fatigue and frustration, didn't align with the smooth reassurances his managers had been feeding him. "Everything's running just fine, Felix," Greg, his district manager, had said last week with a confident grin. "Sure, some folks gripe, but that's just retail, nothing new." But Felix knew better. If things were fine, why were employee resignations spiking? Why were customers flooding review sites with complaints about long waits and disengaged staff? A gnawing doubt settled deep in Felix's gut. Something was being hidden from him, and there was only one way to find out the truth. He had to see it with his own eyes. That night, he made a decision that would change everything. By morning, Felix had shed the image of the polished CEO. His signature designer stubble was gone. He had dyed his dark hair to a dusty brown and traded his usual tailored suit for faded jeans, an old hoodie, and thick-rimmed glasses he didn't need. In his hand, he held a name tag with a new identity: Frank Trainee. He arrived at one of the busiest stores in the chain, a location he'd only seen once, briefly, during its grand opening. The difference now was staggering. The place was buzzing with noise, but not the kind that came from healthy business. It was chaotic, sharp-edged, overwhelmed, exhausted. Rick, the store manager, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, barely looked up when Felix introduced himself. "New trainee?" he muttered. "Great, we're short again. Don't expect much, just follow Mia." Mia, no relation to Felix, was in her mid-20s with deep shadows under her eyes and a uniform that looked like it had seen too many shifts back to back. Yet despite her exhaustion, she gave him a small, kind smile. "Welcome to chaos," she said, handing him an apron. "Stick close. I'll help you survive it." As the hours dragged on, Felix saw with aching clarity just how wrong Greg had been. Only 3 employees were manning the entire store during peak hours. Mia was doing the work of 3 people, running the register, restocking shelves, and handling an endless stream of customer complaints without so much as a breath in between. Nearby, a teenager named Ryan was struggling to manage the incoming inventory, sweat pooling at his collar. An older woman, Sandra, moved slowly and stiffly, clearly trying to keep up but fighting the weight of sheer exhaustion. "Why are we so short-staffed?" Felix whispered to Mia as he bagged items. "People keep quitting," she muttered, scanning with breakneck speed. "Rick won't approve overtime. If someone calls out, we just have to make it work. And hiring, not happening. Too expensive, apparently." Felix's jaw tightened. This wasn't a rough day. It was systemic failure, and it was breaking people. Hours passed like sand through a clenched fist. Mia never stopped moving. Felix watched her closely, noticing the subtle tremors in her hands, the glaze creeping into her eyes. At one point, as she fumbled with counting change, her hands shook so visibly that he leaned in. "You okay?" She smiled faintly, but her voice was paper-thin. "Yeah, just tired." As closing time neared, Mia was still working non-stop. Felix could see her legs wobbling, her steps slowing as if she were moving underwater. Then it happened. She reached up to grab a box and suddenly crumpled to the floor. "Mia!" Felix shouted, dropping the basket he was carrying and rushing to her side. Sandra gasped, frozen in place, while Ryan sprinted over in panic. "She just passed out," he yelled, dropping to his knees beside her. Rick finally emerged from his office, his expression more annoyed than concerned. "What the hell is going on out here?" Felix turned slowly, his voice low and shaking with restrained fury. "She collapsed from exhaustion." Rick scoffed. "She's probably faking it, trying to skip out early." That was the final crack. Felix's patience shattered. He had seen enough. The emotional detachment, the disregard for human limits, the rot at the heart of the system he had built. It all crystallized in this one moment. Sandra was rushing to get water. Ryan was desperately patting Mia's cheek, pleading with her to wake up. The customers nearby had gone still, watching with uneasy silence, and through it all, Rick just stood there, arms crossed, his face devoid of any empathy. Felix clenched his fists. Tomorrow, this store, and the entire company, was going to change. Forever. Rick crossed his arms with a stony, unbothered expression, eyes locked on Mia like she was just another broken cog in his machine. "If she can't handle the job, maybe she doesn't belong here," he said coldly, his voice flat. Felix clenched his fists at his sides, biting down the anger rising in his throat. He forced himself to stay in character, even as his heart thudded painfully in his chest. "Maybe the problem isn't her," he said evenly. "She's been working non-stop without a break. Anyone would collapse under that kind of pressure." Rick rolled his eyes, completely unmoved. No one forced her to stay. She could have walked out like the rest. "I'm not here to babysit anyone." Felix turned his attention back to Mia, kneeling beside her just as her eyes fluttered open. Sandra was gently pressing a bottle of water to her lips. Mia let out a weak cough, then managed to take a sip. "Take it easy," Sandra murmured, voice soft and maternal. Mia's gaze drifted around the room, confused. When her eyes finally focused, a deep flush colored her cheeks. "I'm fine," she whispered, trying to sit up. "You passed out," Ryan said, his voice edged with worry. Mia rubbed her forehead with trembling fingers. "I just got a little lightheaded. It's nothing. I can finish my shift." Felix exchanged a look with Sandra, who subtly shook her head. Mia was trying to act tough, but her body was betraying her. She was beyond her limit. "See?" Rick snorted, voice sharp with sarcasm. "Told you she's fine. Everyone, back to work." Felix stood slowly, his muscles tight with rage he barely managed to contain. His pulse pounded in his ears. This was the rot that had been spreading through his company. A culture where pain was ignored, effort punished, and exhaustion seen as weakness. But he couldn't reveal who he was yet, not until he understood just how deep this problem ran. "You should go home," he said gently to Mia. Rick scoffed again. "If she leaves, that's on her, but I'm not paying her for the hours she didn't work." Felix caught Mia's eyes and saw the hesitation there. Her gaze flicked toward the clock. He could see the math playing out in her head. Every hour lost meant one less meal, one more overdue bill. Her jaw tensed, and she bit her lip, caught between survival and sanity. "You're done for the night," Felix said, his voice firmer this time. "I'll take the rest of your shift." Mia blinked, too exhausted to protest. Rick's face twisted into a scowl. "Since when does a trainee call the shots?" Felix met his glare, fury burning behind his calm expression. "Since I'm not about to stand by and watch someone collapse again." Rick muttered something under his breath, but didn't move to stop Mia as Sandra helped her into a chair near the front. Ryan returned to the shelves silently, eyes dark with something between fear and disgust. Felix stepped behind the register, finishing the shift. He smiled at customers when he could, but inside he was boiling. The deeper he looked, the worse it got. As the last customer left and the doors locked behind them, Felix watched Rick hover nearby instead of heading straight for his office. There was something different in his eyes now. Wariness. Suspicion. "You worked retail before?" Rick asked, trying to sound casual. Felix shrugged. "A while back." Rick snorted. "Figured. You don't complain like the rest." Felix didn't reply. He just watched as Rick walked to the register, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and casually pocketed a few bills like it was nothing. That was it. Felix's gut twisted. His employees were overworked, underpaid, and driven to the edge, and now he had just witnessed theft from the person in charge. This wasn't just poor management. It was moral failure. The next morning, Felix arrived before opening. His disguise was still intact, but the mask felt heavier than ever. He wasn't just playing a role anymore. He was carrying the weight of every person Rick had broken. The store was quiet, filled only with the hum of cooling units and the occasional beep of startup screens. Ryan was already there, half asleep, unloading a pallet of boxes. He glanced up, surprised. "Didn't think you'd come back," he said, yawning. Felix slipped on his apron. "Why's that?" Ryan shrugged. "Most new hires don't last long. Either Rick drives them out or they burn out." He sliced open a box, eyes still heavy with fatigue. "Mia texted. Said she's coming in later. Still doesn't feel great, though." Felix's jaw clenched. She shouldn't be coming in at all. Not after yesterday. Before he could respond, the back office door creaked open and Rick appeared, stretching like a man who'd slept through every alarm. "You're back," Rick said, eyebrows raised. "Guess you're not as soft as I thought." Felix forced a neutral expression. "Figured I'd stick around." Rick grunted and pointed to the registers. "Sandra's on break. Cover for her." Felix moved behind the counter, but his mind wasn't on scanning barcodes. It was counting minutes. He had already made the call that morning, and right on cue, the doors swung open 15 minutes later. A group walked in. 2 men in dark suits, a woman holding a clipboard, and one familiar figure that made Ryan freeze mid-step. Greg, the district manager. Rick's face fell like a curtain being torn down. "What's this?" he barked. Greg ignored him, his eyes scanning the room, then landing on Felix. At first confusion, then sudden recognition. Felix stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Let's talk in the office." Rick looked between them, eyes narrowing, confusion curdling into panic. "Hold on. What the hell is going on?" Felix pulled off his glasses and ran a hand through his hair, shaking loose the last strands of disguise. "I own this company," he said, voice low and cold. "And you're done." The store fell into stunned silence. Ryan nearly dropped the box he'd been carrying, his eyes wide with disbelief. Sandra, returning from the back, clutched her chest like she'd seen a ghost. Even a customer, halfway to the counter, paused and glanced between the figures, curiosity turning into hushed awe. Rick's expression contorted. "You're joking." Felix's voice was quiet but unshakable, cold steel wrapped in resolve. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Rick opened his mouth, but no words came out. Then Greg stepped forward, his presence suddenly towering. "We've received a growing number of complaints about this location, employee mistreatment, payroll issues, and last night our owner personally witnessed one of your staff collapse from exhaustion while you stood there and did nothing." Rick scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "She was fine. She overworked herself. That was her decision." Felix stepped closer, voice low but razor sharp. "She didn't have a choice, Rick. You refused to approve more hires, blocked overtime, and forced this store to run on fumes. You didn't just ignore the signs. You created the conditions that made this inevitable. And you've been skimming from the register." A flicker of panic crossed Rick's face, but he quickly masked it with false bravado. "You can't prove that." Felix nodded toward the clipboard in the woman's hands. "Actually, we can." The woman stepped forward. "We cross-referenced the register logs with your shift schedule. There are repeated discrepancies, missing cash that consistently aligns with your hours." Rick's mask faltered. "This is ridiculous. I've been running this store for years. You can't just—" Felix didn't let him finish. "You're fired." The words sliced through the air like thunder. For a second, no one moved. Then Rick's face contorted with rage. "You think you can just replace me? Good luck finding someone who wants this mess." Felix met his glare head on. "This mess exists because of you. Now get out." Rick looked around the store, at the corporate staff, at the employees standing still behind counters, at Ryan and Sandra who had quietly stopped working. He saw the truth. No one was going to defend him. With a bitter curse, Rick tore off his name tag, flung it onto the counter, and stormed out. The doors slammed behind him. Silence reigned until Ryan let out a long, shaky breath. "That just happened," he muttered, still gripping the box cutter like a lifeline. Felix turned to the staff, his voice warmer now but no less firm. "Things are going to change, starting today." Sandra still looked shell-shocked. "You really own this place?" Felix gave her a small nod. "And I should have been here sooner." Mia hadn't arrived yet, but Felix was already thinking ahead. When she did walk through those doors, it would be into a very different world than the one she'd left the night before. Turning to Greg, he said, "We need to implement immediate fixes, new hires, higher wages, no more pushing people to the edge." Greg nodded without hesitation. "I'll start the paperwork now." As the corporate team began their audit, Felix turned back to Ryan and Sandra. "I want you both to stay. And I need to know everything. Every problem. Every pattern that's been ignored." Sandra straightened up, finally finding her voice. "If you really mean that, then I've got a lot to tell you." "I do," Felix replied. "I want to hear it all." The weight of change was in the air. But it wasn't just about firing Rick. The damage had spread like a slow poison. Fixing it would take more than a statement. It would take action. Ryan shifted nervously from foot to foot, as if unsure what to do without Rick barking orders. Sandra kept glancing at the door, half expecting the tyrant to come storming back in. Felix could see the lingering fear in both of them, the doubt that anything would actually change. He stepped forward, his tone steady but full of empathy. "First things first," he said, addressing all who could hear him. "I want to hear from you. Everything that's been happening here. Everything that's been swept under the rug." Sandra crossed her arms, jaw tightening. "You really want to know?" Felix nodded. "Yes, all of it." She took a deep breath, then started. "We've been running this place on fumes. Not enough people, and the ones who stay are hanging on by a thread. Rick refused to approve hires, so every shift felt like drowning. When we asked for help, he told us to figure it out. If we called in sick, we got guilt-tripped. If we left early, he'd cut our hours the next week. It was punishment, plain and simple." Ryan jumped in, voice sharp with pent-up frustration. "Supplies? Always late. We ran out of the basics. Paper bags, printer rolls, even bottled water. Customers got mad. We took the heat. And breaks," he scoffed. "If you took one, you came back to chaos." So we stopped. We just kept going. Felix's hands balled into fists. Everything he had feared. It was worse, much worse. "We're bringing in a new manager," he said to Greg without hesitation. "Someone with real leadership, someone who values their team." Greg nodded. "I've got a short list. I'll make the calls." Felix turned back to the employees. Until we get someone in place, I'll be here, personally. Starting today, we hire more staff, no more skeleton crews, and everyone gets real breaks. Sandra exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what looked like weeks. That would be a start. Felix wasn't done. As of now, we're raising hourly wages across all stores. No one working full-time should be living paycheck to paycheck. That change starts today. Ryan's eyes widened. Seriously? Felix met his gaze. You've been doing the work of 2 or 3 people. It's long overdue. Sandra shook her head slowly, as if trying to catch up with the moment. I've worked here for years. This is the first time anyone from the top has said that. Felix felt the guilt settle deeper into his chest. That silence, that neglect, was his failure. He had trusted his managers to uphold his vision, and they had betrayed that trust. But no more. The front door opened. Mia stepped inside, moving gingerly as though unsure she was allowed. Her eyes swept the room and then landed on Felix. She froze. You shouldn't be here today, Felix said gently. I'm okay, she replied hesitantly. I didn't want to leave everyone short-staffed. Felix shook his head. You passed out from exhaustion. That's not something we brush off. Mia glanced around, seeing the unfamiliar faces, the clipboard, the absence of Rick. Slowly, realization dawned. You're really the owner? Felix gave a heavy sigh. I am, and I should have seen what was happening here long before now. She studied him for a long moment. I loved this job, she said quietly, or at least I used to. But the way things have been, it's been too much. I know, Felix said, and I'm fixing it. But for today, you're going home with full pay. Her eyes widened. Wait, seriously? You shouldn't have to choose between your health and your paycheck, Felix said, his voice soft but firm. Take the time you need. When you come back, things will be different. Mia looked like she wanted to push back, her lips parting with a quiet protest. But something in Felix's tone, firm, protective, unwavering, made her stop. After a pause, she nodded. Okay. Felix turned toward Greg, his mind already pushing past this store's walls. We'll need to check every other location. If this was happening here, it could be worse elsewhere. Greg was already scribbling in his notepad. I'll arrange site visits for the rest of the week. Felix nodded, then turned back to the staff. This store will operate the way it always should have. And going forward, if you ever feel like something's wrong, if anyone mistreats you or cuts corners, you contact me directly. No more hidden problems, no more managers covering up what they don't want seen. Sandra nodded, slow and hesitant, but there was something hopeful behind it. That's all we ever wanted, someone to actually listen. Felix swallowed the guilt building in his throat. Words weren't enough, not anymore. It had to be action fast and visible. But in the faces of those employees, in their cautious hope, he saw the truth. They hadn't given up, and he wouldn't let them down again. Felix stayed in the store the rest of the day. He walked the aisles, stocking shelves, talking to customers, helping Ryan sort the back room. There was still tension. He could see it in the way people watched him, unsure if this sudden kindness was real or fleeting. But something had shifted. Without Rick looming, the weight in the air had lifted. Not gone, but lighter, like breathing after a storm. Sandra and Ryan moved faster, but not frantically. They spoke to each other, cracked quiet jokes, and started to rediscover a rhythm that had long been lost under fear and fatigue. Later that afternoon, Greg caught Felix's eye and motioned toward a quiet corner near the stockroom. Away from customers, his voice dropped low. We need to talk about the other stores. If things were this bad here, I'm worried. Felix folded his arms, already anticipating what was coming. I've been thinking the same thing. This wasn't an isolated failure. Greg rubbed the back of his neck. Rick wasn't the only one. I reviewed payroll across locations this morning. Overtime's been quietly slashed everywhere. Turnover's high. It's a pattern, and I don't like what it suggests. Felix's stomach turned. This was a company he had built on trust and purpose. Somewhere along the way, that vision had been hijacked. We visit every store, he said without hesitation. No more waiting on sugar-coated reports. Greg hesitated. That could take weeks. Felix shook his head. Not weeks. Days. This can't wait. Greg let out a breath but nodded. All right. I'll make it happen. Back on the floor, Felix watched Sandra step in to help Ryan in the stockroom. They worked efficiently, and more importantly, they weren't just surviving anymore. They were slowly adapting to the idea that it was finally safe to care again. Then the doors opened. A woman in a corporate uniform stepped inside, clipboard in hand. She introduced herself as Dana, an HR rep sent to assist with the transition. Felix shook her hand firmly. We need immediate hiring at this location. I'm not interested in patching leaks. I want a full rebuild. Dana nodded. I've already started going through applications. We'll bring in help fast. He led her through the floor, detailing everything that needed to change. Not just the staffing, but the culture. He didn't want a bandage. He wanted a reset. As they passed the back of the store, Ryan approached, hesitating slightly, eyes flicking between Felix and Dana. Can I say something? Felix turned to him. Of course. Ryan exhaled. A lot of good people left because of how bad it got, but some of them, they might come back, if they knew things were really changing. Felix nodded slowly. In his urgency to fix things, he hadn't even considered those who had already walked away, people who'd loved the job before it turned toxic. You have names? Felix asked. Yeah, Ryan said. A few. Felix turned to Dana. Reach out. Let them know the store's under new management. Tell them the company's changing and ask if they'd like to return. Dana made a note. I'll start today. Ryan's shoulders dropped slightly, a trace of relief softening his expression. They didn't leave because they wanted to, he said. They left because they didn't have a choice. Felix understood that, more than he liked to admit. By closing time, things were already moving. Applications were being reviewed, schedules adjusted, employees were starting to believe, not in promises, but in proof. Felix stood near the front as the last customer exited. Sandra locked the door. Ryan tucked the final box onto a shelf. There was still exhaustion in the room, but it was different now. Not despair, not fear. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes after a long battle, when you finally see light on the horizon. Felix turned to Greg. Tomorrow, we start store visits. Greg gave a short nod. We'll find out how deep this goes. But Felix already knew. It went deeper than he'd ever imagined. And he wasn't going to stop until every corner of his company had been brought into the light.